Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Today I'm speaking with Jeremy Bassetti. You might know him as the host of the popular Travel Writing World podcast. If you haven't heard it, please do check it out. Where I tend to talk to older writers, Jeremy covers the newest releases in the genre. If you like what I'm doing at Personal Landscapes, then you're sure to like his show. I rely on it to stay up to date. But that's not why we're talking today. Jeremy's also a writer, photographer, and professor of humanities, and he's got a new book about a strange religious pilgrimage in an off-the-track corner of Bolivia. That's a country I'm very curious about, and the anthropological angle appealed to me. We spoke about sacred mountains, liminal spaces, and suffering as the root cause of hope. I think you'll find this interesting. Okay, so let's start with place. Why Bolivia?
Well, it's just a fascinating country. It's a country that I never really explored, but I read a lot about. It was kind of like an unknown to me. It was just a fascinating place for me to visit. That's on one level, but on another level, last August, when I went to Bolivia, I was on sabbatical, and the timing was nice because in Bolivia in August, this is kind of like a month of celebrations, especially in the mountain towns, celebrations, in honor of Pachamama, Mother Earth. And I am still doing a project about mountains, and so the timing was nice. It's kind of remote area, hard for me to get to. I'm on sabbatical. I have a glut of time. So Bolivia was kind of like the logical place for me to go for my research and for my sabbatical.
So you describe Bolivia as a world where your assumptions are hard to hold on to and easy to let go of. What did you mean by that?
I think when we travel to a place for the first time, and like a lot of people do like background research and background reading before they go, and they have certain assumptions about the places where they visit. And I certainly did about Bolivia. Like I had a mental image of what it would be like. And, in the process of traveling, I mean, this is one of the great things about traveling is that all of your assumptions about place and people and culture kind of go out the window. It's like the truth and reality is far more complicated and interesting and nuanced than, any of the books will tell us. But in Bolivia, and indeed like the region around the Andes, like we have assumptions about religion and culture, and I think those things were tested quite a bit, especially around the religious tradition aspect in Bolivia. I mean, the assumptions that I had, going into it is that this is a Catholic country. It's a very devout, deeply Catholic country, and what I imagined was, a kind of a pious, official Catholic country. But what I got in return was something far more complicated. Mixture of religious traditions in Bolivia was fascinating, and something that I wasn't really prepared for out of ignorance of my own.
So you said that sacred mountains were a big draw for you. First of all, what is a sacred mountain? Like this concept seems to pop up everywhere, from Shintoism in Japan to high altitude Inca sacrifices, or even high places like that above Petra in Jordan. So what's a sacred mountain, and what interested you about them? And why did you choose to visit this one in particular?
That's a good question. And it's, a question that I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around. Like I'm working on a larger research project about, mountains and sacred mountains and things. This is just an idea. I don't know if this holds any weight, but I'm thinking about like the history of ideas and, the spread of ideas. And it's just fascinating to study history and culture, around the world. And, you have this idea of sacred mountain kind of pop up across cultures, across land, across time, in every continent. It seems that the peoples and the traditions and histories have this understanding about sacred mountain, or mountains associated with spirituality or the divine. I was wondering if if there are any innate ideas, like I wonder if perhaps Sacred Mountain might be one of them, just because we see it's so widespread, ubiquitous across religious traditions and cultures. It's everywhere. And I think, you asked what is a sacred mountain? It's a mountain that, has some sort of spiritual or divine properties to a people. I'm also thinking about like literature here too. And if we think about like some of the oldest literary texts, indeed, like the oldest literary texts, the Sumerian cuneiform texts, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, these ancient texts, in these old writings, like we have this idea of mountain as, a place where if it's not a divinity in and of itself, it's certainly a place where we can conspire with the gods, right? That's really fascinating to find kind of a very similar idea, so diffuse around the world. You asked why Bolivia. Also, Bolivia is kind of synonymous with the Andes and with mountains. Part of what's interesting about Bolivia culturally is that it's quite enclosed, right? It's landlocked. It's one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, certainly in the world, no doubt. And this might sound weird, but there's like the sense that Bolivia is kind of resisting outside ideas and globalism in ways that some of the other countries around the world aren't. So the idea that there's this pure kind of idea or this pure culture in Bolivia is not what I'm trying to say, although it certainly sounds like it. But I was wanting to get to a place where I could investigate this idea of mountain in a country and within a culture that is not pure, but is still retaining some of the old ideas, if that makes sense.
I guess Bolivia is sort of a marginal place. Like, it's apart from the mining industry that's came in and took great advantage of it, because it's so poor and cut off and it's such high altitude. There's a chance for traditions to linger on much longer in these places than places that are more attractive to outsiders to come in and swoop everything up.
Yeah, there's something there. I mean, I think it's wrong to think that Bolivia is like this untouched place, that's kind of resistant to globalism, although maybe there's a little bit of truth in that. But it is, certainly remote. I mean, you can go up into the Altiplano, like the highlands, the high plateau area, and it's just sparsely populated. It's kind of a high altitude wasteland in many respects. There's, vegetation's hard to grow up there. Very few people. It's a harsh and inhospitable, place to be. And, one would imagine that by virtue of geography alone, people would, ideas and people would kind of stay out.
I was just thinking too about sacred mountains. I wonder if there was a period where it sort of transitioned, like you can see why a mountain makes sense. It's closer to the gods, and they must have been kind of strange and frightening places with sudden changes of weather and rarefied air. But there are cultures that place the home of the gods on the mountains, and then it sort of shifts to the mountain itself becoming a sacred place or a holy place. So Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, versus like Shintoism that holds the land itself as having sacred qualities, or Kailash in Tibet. I wonder if that shifted at a certain point when people began to get up to those places and see that the gods didn't actually live there.
Yeah, well, I think Kailash. You mentioned Kailash. I think that hasn't been summited yet, out of respect.
No, they just walk around it. Huh? The pilgrimage goes around it. Yeah.
But I think in Kailash, I think there's some traditions that actually believe that that's the abode of Shiva, right? So associated with divinity or the actual home of the gods. I think these. These are variations of a theme. I'm thinking here about the Mayan pyramids, for example, kind of modeled on the shape of the mountain, right? As a place, as a high point to get as close to God or the divine as possible.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Right? In an absolutely flat setting, they build an artificial mountain to reach the divine.
Yeah. Artificial mountains, yes, manufactured mountains. It's quite interesting, and so that's happening. Trying to connect this idea of the universality of the idea, or maybe the universality of this idea. But we were just talking about the Mayans building pyramids, and I'm thinking back to the Sumerians, right, with the ziggurats, right? Around the Tigris and the Euphrates River. I mean, it's kind of from what I understand, a relatively flat place that, these civilizations are building pyramids, the Tower of Babel, going up because that's, God is somewhere above, up there.
So was there a reason that you chose this specific festival to attend, or this specific mountain?
Yeah, timing really. There's a pilgrimage that people go on to the sacred mountain once a year in August, around mid-August, August 15th. And with my sabbatical and the timing and all that, I mean, that's part of the reason why I went to Bolivia here too, is because of the timing. Like, this would be my only chance really, with between my teaching and all my other obligations, for me to go see this. This town is a town called Quillacollo, and it's quite a big town, but it's a town that no one has really heard of. Its bigger brother, I guess, is a town about 30 minutes east called Cochabamba, and maybe people have heard of that. Quillacollo is, it's in the same valley, the Cochabamba Valley, in kind of the foothills of the Andes, 8,500 feet, foothills, right? For me from Florida, that's like really high, right? But for them, that's, not even getting up there. But there's this beautiful little valley, surrounded by this Cordillera. But at the southern part of Quillacollo, there's a hill that for many, many, many years, according to the scholars, was like a kind of a sacred hill. Some of the scholars would point out to this idea in the Andes of a huaca. And what that is just like kind of like this sacred space. So like the peak of a mountain might be a huaca, or like a spring or a cave or something like that, like this natural phenomena as like sacred space. On the hill south of this town, there was purportedly this huaca, this sacred spring, which the native Andeans kind of visited on their own right. And over the course of years, perhaps we'll get to this, this became associated with, after the Catholics came, it became associated with the Virgin Mary. So now, in 2022, which is when I went, 2023, just the pilgrimage just ended a few weeks ago. We have this kind of interesting syncretism or blend of pre-Catholic indigenous ideas with Catholic ideas.
Yeah, you wrote about shaman blessing people and objects on the hill itself, but there didn't seem to be any sign of priests up there. Was the Catholic side of it confined to the town below and the churches?
It's a complicated question. If you can imagine a hill, and then at the very top of the hill, this is where kind of a lot of the action happens. But on the slopes leading up to the hill, there is a Catholic shrine, a sanctuary. And there's a little chapel there where people, take candles and, burn candles. But if you go beyond the chapel and the shrine, you can walk up these paths to a different part of the hill where there's kind of different things, let's say, going on. Of course, in the main town, there is a cathedral, an important cathedral. And of course, the priests go to the chapels and the shrines. But you're right, I didn't see, as soon as you walk up the hill past the shrine and the chapel, I didn't see any priest or anyone, associated with, the religious institution, the Catholic institution, up there. That's not to say that they're not there, but I just didn't spot any of them. But I remember one day I was in Cochabamba. It was a few days before the festival, and I was in the main square, the main public square, in front of the church. And, I was just kind of relaxing, trying to catch my breath. And there was a performer in the square, two performers, a man and a woman. And, they had a keyboard set up, and, this guy had a mic hooked up to this old kind of distorting speaker. And, they're playing religious songs, he on the keyboard and she singing. And when they were done with songs, in between songs, he would take the mic and, lob these fiery jeremiads at the crowd about Pachamama and about the celebrations that were about to happen. It was wonderful to hear him because he was so expressive. He was saying, "You're going to burn in hell, aye, aye, aye," that kind of thing. But his point was well taken, right? This idea, he's a devout Catholic that's very resistant to the encroachment of these Andean ideas and the blending of them with Catholicism. So officially, the official Catholic idea in Bolivia is what you would find perhaps in Rome. But in terms of like popular religion or the lived religion, most of the people, at least the ones that I saw, don't make a distinction between Catholic and pagan, or Pachamama and Mother Mary.
I found the sheer variety of votive offerings really interesting as well. Like you described the usual arms and legs and crutches and spectacles that you would find at a site of pilgrimage, but there are also shops, and not just shops, but specific types of shops.
Yeah.
That's very precise.
Yeah. No, it was, this was about the assumptions, right? So I think you're referring to the alacita vendors on the hill itself. Yeah. So alacitas are kind of these miniature objects. It's like miniature baby, miniature tire shop, miniature bakery, miniature passport, miniature credit cards, birth certificates, diplomas, miniature cash, you name it, right? And things of perceived value, there are miniature objects of those things. And the idea, they're called alacitas, which literally means in the native language, buy me. And so the idea is that we buy these objects, right, as a way to wish or pray for the real things that they represent. And this is a tradition that we find also in La Paz. There's this big kind of Alacitas festival there, but that has kind of, I don't know if it's originated in La Paz and spread to Quillacollo or the inverse, but we see this tradition in both places. And during the festival, of course, people would walk down the streets and on their way to this, holy mountain, the sacred mountain, to go to the sanctuary of the Virgin Mary, and then beyond that to go see Pachamama. They would, be presented, or they would approach all of these shops to buy things in order to make a bundle for a ceremony to ask or wish for those items. You have this image of like the Bolivian Cholita woman with the cloth on her back carrying potatoes or a child, right? That cloth is called the aguayo. And even they have a miniature one of that in which to bundle the alacitas or the objects, which get blessed. Sometimes they get engulfed and immersed in like incense. Sometimes they get set ablaze. They get burnt and then get buried. But there's this kind of ritual aspect of it. And the fascinating thing is that, sometimes people are like pouring holy water on that, or, putting like a crucifix in there, or, praying to God that, Pachamama will they will receive these things from the earth that they give to the earth.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The specificity of it was really, really interesting. That's some very clear envisioning. So tell me about this business of breaking rocks. That's also very strange.
At the foot of the hill, there's a gate, right? This beautiful gate. And then you walk in and there's like this little tended garden at the bottom, like a Garden of Eden. As you ascend the hill, you'll encounter the sanctuary and then the chapel. And then beyond that, there are these two paths, one left and one right, that go to the summit. And at the summit, you'll find all of these shops and people selling those objects, but you'll also find these things called mines. They call them minas, mines. And if you can picture, I don't know if you can like imagine, if you're looking down bird's eye view onto like Moroccan tanneries, you can see these pits. But imagine instead of that, like you're looking down on, this like honeycomb of swimming pools, these large swimming pool pits. And inside of each swimming pool are these, massive boulders, right? And sometimes the boulders were, the size of a beanbag or something, but sometimes they were huge, like bigger than a human, right? Massive boulders. And that's everywhere on the top of this hill. It's like a hive, like a beehive up there of mines everywhere. And so part of the tradition during this, and sometimes also not during the pilgrimage, but the activity intensifies during the pilgrimage, I'm told. You go into the mine in order to break off a stone. And so you take these sledgehammers, you perform a ritual, drink a little beer, pour some beer out to Pachamama, and you start hitting one of these stones. And the idea is that you want to break off a large chunk of stone, because that means you're being favored, right? This is sort of a gift. And this idea kind of traces back to the legend of the pilgrimage that went on. Maybe I should talk about that for a second. I don't know why, but for some reason, if you think about like the Marian apparitions around the world, right? They tend to happen on mountains, right? And they tend to Mary tends to present herself to like peasants or shepherds or people of the mountains. So we have one in like Mexico, right? The Virgin of Guadalupe. We have in France, like Virgin of Lourdes, Mary of Lourdes, Fatima of Portugal, all everywhere, right? It seems. And there's also one in Bolivia, the Virgin of Urcupiña. So according to the legend, 17th century legend, 18th century legend, I'm sorry, a shepherd girl was on the hill tending her flock, her livestock, when she saw Mary and baby Jesus. And there are different versions of the legend, but one of the legends is that Mary gifts the child some stones, some rocks, which later transform to either gold or silver, according to some accounts, or more livestock. From that legend, there is this tradition to go up to this hill and smash these stones, because these are symbols of material prosperity, right? It's in that tradition that people, the devout, go up there to break these stones in hopes that they will receive some material prosperity as part of this ritual, as part of this pilgrimage.
It almost seems like there's an element of sacrifice to it as well, right? Like you have to sacrifice something, the sweat of your brow, the blisters on your hands to earn this grace.
Absolutely. Like the more, the idea is like, the more devout you are, the bigger stone you get, right? Which is maybe a perversion, because I mean that stone is really hard to break. I saw some guy kind of trying to smash up a stone and with a sledgehammer, and the head of the sledgehammer popped off. He was drenched in sweat. He couldn't even break off a shard that he was comfortable with. So there is this kind of physical act of kind of giving this penance, given in doing that. And it's also like associated too with like the dancing. There's we didn't talk about this yet, but there's a festival, a parade associated with this pilgrimage, and it's a massive kind of parade and festival. But you think about like high altitude parade, people wearing these heavy costumes and these heavy outfits, blowing into panpipes or brass instruments, and twirling and dancing for miles at 8,500 feet altitude, or whatever that is in meters, 2,500, whatever. I mean, there's like this physical intensity that's required in this performance of piety. The physical demands in dancing and performing in the festival, the physical demands required to get up to the hill and break off some stone, that's nothing to take lightly.
And there's the connection to the physical rituals and how they shift you into this other space, into the sacred through repetitive motions and trance and work. Yeah. So you wrote that the Hill of the Skull is a place that makes you question your own beliefs and faith. It makes you call into question whether the customs and rituals carried out on its slopes are absurd, or if your own lack of faith will cost you and your loved ones. Do you think you need to be a believer to go on a pilgrimage or to benefit from one?
Well, I mean, I certainly didn't. I wasn't a believer, and yet I got pulled into kind of this work, this ritual that you were speaking about. I think in some respects, you need to be a Catholic or part of that cosmovision, the blending of Catholic and Andean ideas. You need to be part of that world in some respects to engage with that, that world, or at least accepting of it. But that doesn't mean that's where all the value is, right? An atheist, like me, going on this pilgrimage, getting sucked into this pilgrimage in some ways wasn't about religion, but was about reflecting on suffering and reflecting on hope. So yeah, I don't think you need to be religious to go on a pilgrimage or think about pilgrimage as a secular act.
No, the physical act itself is transformative,
Yeah.
I think. Right. So did you come away with different beliefs afterwards, or did it change your thinking or how you see the world in any way?
Yeah, well, yeah, because I find myself not just a skeptic, but, and this is going to come out weird, but like sometimes like very suspicious and skeptical of people's religious experiences. After having gone to Bolivia and rubbing shoulders with other pilgrims and speaking with them, like I changed my mind about it. In some ways, like I think that personally, we're talking about hope and what good is praying and what good is hope, and shouldn't you actually be doing something about it? There those questions, but the prayers and the rituals were giving people comfort, right? And we're having some sort of value on that level. And so I don't want to judge too harshly, people and how they process things and deal with their religious experiences. I mean, I think that was one of the big takeaways for me personally, personal transformation. Those types of revelations, I think, come to us by participating in these pilgrimages.
So the image of the wasteland comes up often in both your writing and in the photos. You open with an epilogue by T.S. Eliot, and when writing about the hill, you describe it as unremarkable, uninviting, desolate, forsaken. It is a wasteland, you say, and it is magical. What is it about that image that obsesses you?
Yeah, that poem by Eliot is just wonderful. The wasteland as a metaphor of humanity, of life. Right? There's just so much there. What obsesses me about that image, had a lot to do with what I was going through personally at that point in time. This is kind of me going on a research trip to do the scholarly work. But behind the scenes, we all are suffering in some ways. And at this point of my life and on that trip, I was having a hard time. Like I felt like I was a character in a T.S. Eliot poem, right? I was like a hollowed man. I was living in a wasteland. And this metaphor kept on coming back to me. I walk up to this desolate area and I see desolation, I see suffering. It's hard to see pilgrims dealing with loss and asking for, abundance. And it's hard to see those things. So this idea of like the wasteland, abundance, hope and suffering, feeling hollowed and unfulfilled. This imagery, it was very much part of my lived experience. And in Bolivia, it seems like, those notions were following me and haunting me while I was there.
You also captured this really well in the photos too. The hill itself, like you describe it as a vantage point overlooking a plain where sacred and profane meet, where the veil is thin. And this whole concept of liminal spaces is interesting. Like for those unfamiliar with it, it's in anthropology, it's often associated with rites of passage. So the classical anthropologists like Arnold van Gennep, he wrote a book, Rites of Passage, and Victor Turner, The Forest of Symbols. These liminal space and rites of passage describe a sort of an in-between stage where the participant in the ritual is no longer what they were before, but they haven't yet become the new thing either. And, social hierarchies are dissolved. Maybe even the stable self is dissolved and things become fluid and malleable. The Jungians applied this concept also to times of transition, like a midlife transition or crisis in the cliche would be seen as a time of liminality, where the individual kind of goes through a turbulent period of self-realization. So it's interesting how the place and what you saw in it reflects also the state that you were going through at the time in your personal space. And that you happen to be drawn right to this place of liminality, in this place where the sort of the veil is thin between the sacred and the profane.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. This study. I'm also drawing a lot from the Romanian scholar of comparative religion, Mircea Eliade. He talks about this as well. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, this idea of liminal spaces where, those paths that I mentioned before, one leading to the left and the other one leading to the right. And the one leading to the right is kind of a cleaner path. Literally, it wasn't as dirty as the left path, but it was kind of open. If you take the left path, and I see like the sinister kind of reference here, then with the left, this is where the shaman and the atiri and the almatas, they're called, and the people who douse you with incense and libations and things like that, they're all amassed on the left flank, the left path. And as you walk up this path, you have no choice but to be enveloped by Palo Santo and incense, and to walk among the other pilgrims. Right. This is not like just a casual stroll up a mountain. Like, you get drawn into that. You have no choice but to be a part of that, even as an observer. Right. The dirt and the smoke and the confetti, all of that kind of goes on you. Right. It kind of penetrates your clothes, and you emerge at the top of the hill, kind of cleansed in some way, in some ritualistic way. Even if you don't realize it, you can't get that off of you, and it lingers. Back home, you smell the incense still, and it follows you around. It haunts you. So I think you're absolutely right to make those 2 points. That it's fascinating that here I was at a point in my life, kind of this midlife point where I'm questioning things, and I go to this kind of midpoint on the hill where I'm trying to pass through from one side to another. And beautiful metaphors there. But I think, definitely kind of a liminal space between the mundane and the divine. And as an atheist, like, I still think I'm floating in some liminal space. Like,
it completely makes sense, because our own society lacks these spaces and rituals that help us navigate through these kind of transitions. Especially with the decline of traditional religion. That's one thing that traditional religion brought, was these practices, physical practices or ritual practices. We have rites like marriage, or which has sort of become a civic contract or a legal contract rather than a rite, and it's easily dissolved now. I wonder if that's partly why so many people feel lost or disconnected, or even trapped in adolescence. Like, it's difficult to move beyond these stages of life when there's no clear demarcation point and no guidance. So I could see how pilgrimage could be one approach to it, whether you invent your own or you go on an existing pilgrimage and use this as a space to sort of navigate that transition, that sort of life changes.
The rite of passage, right, of becoming a man or a woman. I think you're absolutely right to say that modern society has tried to rid ourselves from those types of things, although many traditions still hold on to them. Very important, I think. Even as someone who is not religious, there is benefit in having traditions and being connected, or seeking answers to questions through traditions and through secular rituals. I mean, I think that we could do well by those ideas.
Yeah, I think it's not so much that we destroy them, but that it's sort of a byproduct of, like, Nietzsche's Death of God, when when you chuck that sort of belief out the window, we also don't realize that we're losing all these other things as well, things that used to anchor people's lives. And, there have been attempts to come up with this secular humanist sort of versions of this, which ends up being shrines to science and all this kind of stuff. It just doesn't work in the same way. It's missing something. There's a philosopher, John Gray, who I really like, my favorite thinker. And he wrote a book called Feline Philosophy, like what we can learn from cats. It's sort of a kind of a funny book, because he says cats have no need of philosophy. They just can live in the present and enjoy their life such as it is without worrying about it. But at the end, he kind of gives some prescriptions for how to have an enjoyable or happy life. And he said, if you're kind of feeling lost, or you can't live with the fact that it's all for nothing and it's whatever you make of it, then take up a religion, but preferably one with a lot of physical practices and ritual practices, because there's value in the ritual itself.
Yeah, for sure. And you were mentioning Nietzsche, and it reminds me of that classic Marx quote where I forget where he wrote this, but he talks about, like, this is the modern world, this is globalization, this is what capitalism does. It, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy becomes profane. And through other kind of forces, this is what Marx is saying, the traditional world gets destroyed. And, whether that's true, that's another thing, but it's a beautiful image nonetheless.
There's much to be said for prosperity and material prosperity, but at the same time, it doesn't give meaning, and neither does the accumulation of things. Like, you quickly realize that just doesn't, apart from the accumulation of books, which I have to say that's we can make an exception for that. Yeah. But another thing that interested me too about the essay that you included in the book, you talked about failed projects and how you were kind of despairing early on that this project just didn't get off the ground. And I wonder if the problem is the pre-planned. Like, from your description, you seem to have in mind the type and style and even the subject of the photos that you would make, but the journey only really opened up for you when you began to let that go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's part of that, and also anticipation, right? Like, I think I was putting too much weight on this project, and what I was trying to do. I was putting too much hope into it. I was placing too much importance on it. I was trying to pre-visualize everything so that I wouldn't waste any time. Everything, had its own place, right? It was kind of this structured thing. And you're absolutely right to say that when I realized that my plans had fallen through, that's when things for me opened up, and in this very kind of curious way. Just for the listeners to get a little bit of a backstory, like, I went there with a few projects. I went to Bolivia with a few kind of goals or projects in mind. One was this, like, to do research for the larger mountain project that I had. But while I was in Kyokoyo, I had this kind of grand idea to take photographs of some of the dresses, the traditional dresses, as kind of like a record or a document, that kind of thing. And I had everything kind of mapped out. I had everything planned. And I thought for sure that I would kind of go in and succeed. But, it was, in hindsight, it was completely naive for me to think that I could pull off a project like this in a country that I'd never been to. And, there's a lot of problems with it. But as soon as I realized that my plans had fallen through, it was like I was given kind of a new path to walk down, a new mission. And I got reconnected with, I don't know, I don't want to sound too woo about it, but it was like this idea, like, I failed. I had a sense of, like, resignation, and then, like, I found my way while I was there because of letting go of those preconceived projects that I had.
Yeah, no, there's nothing new agey about that at all. I think travel is very much like that. Like, there's a tyranny to the pre-planned, and those kind of experiences only happen if you just sit and wait for a person or a direction or a shaman to appear. I thought a lot about this kind of thing when I first started writing long narrative features for travel magazines. Like, I do a lot of reading to figure out what interested me about a place and where the stories might be. But but the main hook would never end up being there. That sort of key poetic insight that would anchor the story for me,
Mm-hmm.
and unlock a place for me. I knew that I always had to just go there and wait for that to appear, and to trust that it would. And that's a bit of an anxious feeling when you're there on somebody else's dime, but it always did. It always showed up. So realizing that you just can't impose your own agenda, and just stepping back and waiting for, and being receptive and open, and just kind of watching and waiting for some strange character to appear, or a shaman to appear out of the incense, like you describe at the end.
Yeah, I suppose I could have written a different story. Like I could have written a story that talks about, this very cold historical story that talks about the religion, that talks about history, and it talks about culture, that kind of work I could have pulled out. But this, when you mentioned this poetic insight, I mean, I think those types of things you can't necessarily plan, as you're saying, right? Those poetic insights come to you, right? And it's like calling on the muses, so to speak, right? You invoke something else. You can't plan that.
And that's what's so exciting about it. That's what makes it so enjoyable.
Yeah. And it would, the book would be a completely different book had I not chosen to write about that serendipity, that chance encounter, that moment where I let go. Like that story was, that experience was calling me, right, to write about. I started, when I was putting this thing together, I had 15,000 really dry words, right? It's kind of really dry, kind of historical and cultural, and quite by the book, and if you ask me, a little bit boring, but there was this part of the story that kept on calling me back. This is where the soul of the story is, right? And so I decided to kind of scrap all of that I have some of the historical and cultural in the book, right? But that's not what the story is about, right? The story is not the history. It's about, this serendipitous moment, the moment where I became a pilgrim.
So did nailing down that story then shape your selection of images?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I had twice as many images as I do now in the book, and it also dictated or helped me arrange the images in a certain way, right? The images that you'll see in the book are not in order of chronology, right? I was trying to tell a story through the images, going to the mountains, going to the sacred hill, going down into the city to the church, and then back to the hill for the rituals. And they're arranged in such a way because that's kind of what happens in the story a little bit. It's interesting how when you're working on a project like this, how, one thing that you didn't intend to write about becomes the interesting part, right? And how that kind of takes over, and, that concept or that idea guides everything along in such a interesting and cohesive way. It takes on a life of its own. It seems like.
Yeah. You just have to let it take over. So you mentioned Alice Tomlinson and August Sander as photographers that you really liked. What was it about their work that inspired you?
So August Sander, he's an old photographer who used to take pictures, these massive cameras as they were back then, these large format cameras of people, right? The people being the central focus, the people in their everyday, presumably everyday lives, in their everyday dress, the people of the crowd, the people of the here and now, or the then and there, right? And for me, I get the sense that he captures a moment, right? A moment in time that's now long lost. Alice Tomlinson, she is a contemporary photographer, British contemporary photographer, and she's doing similar things as August Sander did. She's taking pictures of, her recent book is called L'Isolani, The Islanders, where she goes to islands around Italy, like Sicily, and takes images of people in their kind of traditional dress in these very beautiful ways, using a large format camera. And there's something interesting about capturing the world in this documentary style and taking it serious. It's not like a snapshot like a tourist might take of somebody in costume, but this is like treating the subject and the culture in a very serious way that interested me. We don't often see that in kind of travel photography, certainly. I guess sometimes you do, but not the tourist photographer. You don't really see it in that kind of way. This dignified, respectful, grave, the serious, respectful way that an image sometimes demands. We see that in her work, and in August Sander's work. And this was like something that I was trying to emulate when I was in Bolivia. Like I wanted to take these types of images of the costumes and of the people while I was there, but it proved to be, I guess, far more difficult than it sounds.
We had some really good photos of shaman in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very dignified looking, and there's a sort of a power that emanates from them. You can see this.
Yeah, we talk about like poetic insights and those special moments that just grab you. And I remember in particular one of the first shaman that I took a photo of. Just kind of asked him, and he said, I should preface this with I asked a lot of people if I could make their photos and their portraits, and I was met by a lot of rejections. Like people were really suspicious of me for some reason. But this shaman that I went up to after an entire day of rejection, he just said, "Okay." I felt this connection with him as he let me make his portrait. And this image of his face is this image. It's one that stays with you, or it stayed with me a little bit. I was thinking about it all day and all night. Part of the narrative, I get an email from a friend who had asked me to get a ceremony, a shaman to do a ceremony for her daughter who had a brain tumor. And this shaman was I just knew it. Like this was the guy who needed to do that ceremony. So from that point on in the book, it becomes, a quest to find him. But yeah, the power of these images there's something real. I think they stick with you. They remain with you, or they did for me, certainly.
So you close your essay with some thoughts about hope. You say, hope is not the result of suffering. It is its root cause. So why did you invert that?
This was a hard book for me to write in a lot of ways, because it helped me, process, right, a lot of things that I had been suffering with in terms of my marriage and in terms of my work, and just in terms of life. And I was thinking when I was on the Hill of the Skull in Bolivia about how much suffering there was. Because I think, when we put too much hope in things, right, we begin to suffer out of the expectation that our hopes will be met. I'm thinking here now, and I didn't write about this in the book, but I think here about kind of the Buddhist tradition and, this idea of suffering and desire, right? And this is essentially one of the Four Noble Truths, that we suffer because of our desires
and attachments, yeah,
and attachments in our desires. And I find that hope is a form of desire. It's not a material thing, but it certainly is a desire. Put so much hope on my projects and in my work and on I just put this hope in this and in virtue of putting the hope, having so much hope, this places a certain degree of pressure and suffering when ultimately those hopes remain unfulfilled.
That Buddhist attachment is interesting too, because it's when you release that attachment to the outcome that things actually open up for you, and maybe you get a result you didn't expect.
Right, and that's a beautiful tie-in here with what you were saying about the poetic insights. I wish I had thought about that when I was writing the book.
There's still time, man. There's still time. You can have that one. So to cite John Gray again, he said in a recent podcast interview that hope isn't necessarily optimism. hope can be going on because you never know what comes next, and it may be better. I really like that idea. It's just not a blind optimism, but it's just going on anyway, because what comes afterwards, there's every chance that it could be better.
No, I just wonder if hope is different than acceptance. This idea of abiding. Hope seems to me a bit more active than accepting. It's
not passive. Yeah, it's like it's Beckett. I can't go on, I will go on.
Right.
So how can listeners get a copy of The Hill of the Skull?
Well, The Hill of the Skull, you can get a copy by going to jeremybassetti.com/skull. And if you go there, that will take you to the Kickstarter campaign. So I'm crowdfunding this book. I think, as you can tell, the book it's not a traditional book. There are words. There's a 7,000 word memoir, and there are 50 or so images. There's an afterword by Pico Iyer, and a kind of dialogue that I had with Alice Tomlinson, the photographer who we just spoke about. Untraditional, atypical book. And so I'm kind of obliged to kickstart it, to crowdfund it. There's no other way that I can really publish it without that. So if you go to jeremybassetti.com/skull, that will take you to the Kickstarter page, where until late October, you can support a copy, which the proceeds will go into producing this beautiful hardcover limited edition book.
Yeah, it's an interesting model, and I'll be curious to see where you go with it. I know some musicians who use this approach to bring their music directly to the people who want to hear it. And some of these guys went the big record label route in the 80s, and they often ended up after the parties were over, they had very little to show for it. So this whole crowdfunding thing is a really cool throwback to earlier publishing models that I think is innovative and interesting and quite promising.
Yeah, we'll see. We're going back to this idea of hope. Like, I'm putting a lot of hope in the success of this project, but it's one of those things that you'll never really know what happens with it. But you're right; it's an interesting model, especially with what's going on in the publishing world and the publishing industry now. I think more and more writers and publishers are interested in this sort of independent route. It gives them more power. It has the potential to give them more cash in the pocket if things go well. It seems to be quite interesting for the writer, for the creator, for the photographer.
Well, thank you for your time, Jeremy, and for this interesting glimpse into Bolivia, a country I'm very curious about. And I really like this whole liminal space and pilgrimage concepts. That's right up my alley. So very interesting.
Well, thank you for having me. And I would just say here, like, huge fan of the podcast, and I'm just so grateful to speak with you.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.